Hey what's up guys, I'm your host Niru, and these glasses are a bit too reflective, so I'm gonna have to take them off for this video, and now I'm out of focus, so just wait for me a while I fix that. Alright, that's much better now. I'm still the same person, don't be scared, I just don't have my glasses now. Okay, so now about a week ago, I did an unboxing of my new iPhone 11 in red. If you haven't seen that, the link is in the description below. I highly recommend it. A lot of people have liked it. I got a lot of great feedback. So if you haven't, share some love. The link is in the description. Now, ever since that video, I've been using the iPhone 11 all day, every day for about a week and a half now. I've put it through its paces. I know the good, the bad, and the ugly about it. So in this video, I'm going to be going through all of that, plus my thoughts on whether you should buy this phone, who it's targeted for, whether or not it's really a worthy upgrade. So now there's a lot to get through, but I'm going to try and keep this video as short and succinct as possible. So you might want to juice up with some coffee, milk, tea, whatever you want. But without any further delay, let's jump straight into the review. Now to begin with the most obvious one, the design. Now Apple this year didn't make any crazy new changes to their smartphone body. They still have the same rounded corners and edges, same button placement, same notch up the top, same bezel, and same lightning connector with the symmetrical speakers down the bottom. But this year the biggest changes are around the back of the phone, the most noticeable being the cameras. And for the iPhone 11, that's the new dual camera vertical setup. So now personally, I like that a lot more than the triple camera setup. Now that triple camera setup certainly does look very weird. It's not my style of a phone. This iPhone 11's dual camera vertical setup is everything that I ever wanted. Now, although I like the visual and aesthetic aspect of this year's cameras, I don't like their practicality. And now this is not just for rocking on a table when it's flat. Just live with it at this point. But because of the shape and design of the camera bump this year, I'm actually really scared that I'm going to be scraping or even breaking the camera lens on the back itself. So now it's a bit hard to see, but if you run your finger along the back camera bump, you'll notice that there are actually 3 separate bumps. So the first actually being the camera square that protrudes from the entire back body. And then from that camera square, you have the 2 lens housing units. And within those housing units, the actual lens for the cameras protrude just a little bit. But now moving the phone around when it's laying flat, I'm actually really scared that there's going to be dust or sand or something go between the lens and the lens housing, or maybe even scratching or scraping or even breaking the actual camera lens. And now we also have the Apple logo shifting down to the center of the phone. And now actually holding it, you might not think that that Apple logo is dead center, but if you actually measure it, it does turn out that it's dead center. So don't trust your eyes on everything, it's dead center. And now personally, I don't really care where the Apple logo is on the back of the phone, as long as it looks fine and as long as the logo is actually there, I don't really mind. Now all the iPhones this year don't have any text on the back, except for the product red version on the iPhone 11, which is the one I got, so you can see the product red text down the bottom. Now personally, I love having some text at the bottom of my iPhone. I would have preferred for it to say iPhone, but having product red is fine, just as long as that there's some text down the bottom, because I find that a lot better looking than just having a plain back iPhone. But if the text on the back is not your kind of thing, then you have 5 other colors to choose from. Just choose wisely. And now speaking of the colors, we have the red in studio right now, and damn, this thing looks so good. Now, I know it's not the same color as the iPhone XR. Some people like that more because it's a lot darker and richer red, but this candy red I really, really like. So now red is a very flashy color and not a lot of people want to go with that. But if you don't, then there's a lot of other options available. You also have a yellow, you have a green, which is really closer to like a teal-ish color. You also have a black and a white. The black and white look really good, so if you wanted a more de facto standard phone color, then the black or white would be what I recommend, because you really can't go wrong with having a black or white iPhone. They're the OG. And now moving on to performance, iPhones generally are known to have the top of the line insane performance right out the gate, and this year is no difference. The A13 Bionic is literally and figuratively a beast. And this year in particular, I think that this iPhone 11 is probably the best performing iPhone out of any, including the iPhone 11 Pros. So not only did this iPhone 11 get the A13 Bionic, it also got a spec bump. So instead of having 3 GB of RAM last year, it has 4 GB of RAM this year, which is exactly the same as the iPhone 11 Pro and the bigger 11 Pro Max. So all the phones have exactly the same specs, and the iPhone 11 has a much lower resolution display, so that means that with that RAM and the A13 Bionic, it's pushing a lot less pixels, so it should be able to do the same tasks a lot quicker and also be able to multitask a lot better than the iPhone 11 Pros and 11 Pro Maxes. And now having the same specs across the board, I don't think the iPhone 11 will be spectacularly faster than the iPhone 11 Pro or Pro Max. Now in day-to-day tasks, I'm pretty sure most people won't even be able to tell the difference, but it's when it comes to that performance speed test that the iPhone 11 will really show that it can beat the iPhone 11 Pro and 11 Pro Max. And that's saying something, especially since the iPhone 11 Pros are supposed to be Pro. And now for all that crazy spec talk, in layman's terms, it means that there's going to be smooth app scrolling and app launching. There's going to be no shutter lag. Multitasking is going to be a breeze. And you're going to be able to do a lot more powerful things with your phone that you may not necessarily realize that you need. And now along the lines of daily use and performance, we're also going to have to talk about the displays on the iPhone 11. And now here's where there's actually a real substantive difference between the iPhone 11 Pros and the iPhone 11. So the iPhone 11s have a sub 1080p LCD display, whereas the iPhone 11 Pros have an OLED Super Retina XDR, I need a better name, display. Now all the jokes aside, the Super Retina XDR display is actually quite impressive. Although it may not have the biggest pixel count or the highest pixel density, it is probably the highest quality OLED in any smartphone right now. So sacrificing that for the LCD display on the iPhone 11 is actually quite a big jump. And now using the iPhone 11 every day, I really can't tell that it's a sub 1080p display. It's super bright and has really good viewing angles, so I kind of just live with it. In fact, the only time I really notice that the phone is not that sharp is when I take photos from this camera and I view it on my laptop next to my phone, and I start to see the difference in sharpness between the two. But other than that, just using it on a day-to-day basis for reading, social media, I don't even notice that the display has been sacrificed. So TLDR, if you're coming from an iPhone that's older than the iPhone 10, so the iPhone 8 onwards, you won't really notice anything wrong with the display. Now you're probably not going to be like, oh my god, this is the best thing I've seen in my life. You're probably not going to have that reaction, but you're not going to say, oh my god, this is not 1080p. You won't. And now fun fact, a person saw me using this phone in public and asked me which Samsung phone I was using because he thought I had a Samsung because of how bright my display was. So that should give you an idea of just how good the display is to a common man's eye. Now I know that this is also only a 60Hz display, but we have the OnePlus 7T that came up with the 90Hz display for $100 cheaper than the iPhone 11. I haven't used 90Hz, so I can't really say what you're missing out on or what you're not getting, but as far as I know, 60Hz is fine unless you've been spoiled by the 90Hz displays. So unless you're in that camp, the 60Hz display should work perfectly fine for you as well. And in fact, the iPhone 11 Pros also don't have a 90Hz display, so sticking with iPhones, you're really not missing out on that much in terms of the display. And once again, 3D Touch is not on the iPhone 11, but none of the phones have it this year, so I guess you're not really missing out on much. Now this phone also had a spec bump in terms of water resistance, so it's now IP68 rated compared to IP67 on the iPhone XR. And now this is only rated for 30 minutes at 2 meters, whereas the iPhone 11 Pros are rated for an hour at 4 meters. So it's not as good as the iPhone 11, but the IP68 is industry standard, so you're not missing out on that much. And now moving on to the thing that we're all really here for, the cameras. Now I'll cut to the chase. I feel that the iPhone 11s have the best camera out of any smartphone in the market right now. Yes, including the Pixel 3. And now that's only until the Pixel 4 comes out, but we can only speculate just how good that will be. But until then, I think the iPhone 11's camera is almost perfect in terms of just pointing, shooting, and capturing. Now with the standard wide-angle camera, I find that it's almost always perfectly exposed with an insane amount of dynamic range, and the sharpness is always on point. So as a point and shoot camera for the usual person, the iPhone 11 works perfectly fine. And even with pretty low light, I feel that the iPhone performs a lot better than Pixels or Samsung's, even without having to turn on the night mode. Now I feel like my point is really shown in these two photos from the Pixel 3 and from the iPhone 11. You can see that the iPhone really managed to nail down the white balance, as well as having a lot more detail in the shadows, as well as being able to have a lot of detail in the sky, whereas the Pixel really doesn't manage to compare that well. Now this year the sensor sizes on the iPhones have increased by a little bit, so you're also going to be able to see a slightly better shallow depth of field in the photos that you take, as well as having 100% focus pixels across the larger sensor, so it's going to be slightly faster autofocus as well as better autofocus tracking of the subject when taking videos. So now both of those things do mean that the iPhone's cameras have got a lot better. Now the inclusion of the wide-angle lens in this budget iPhone is of course props to Apple, but it's also, I feel, the worst part about the camera system on the iPhone 11s. Now Apple talked a lot on stage about the consistency between the two in terms of white balance, sharpness, and clarity, but actually using this in person and in real life, I feel that there's quite a big difference in terms of the qualities between the two cameras. Now the wide-angle lens I found always to be a little softer as well as a little warmer than the standard wide-angle, and there's definitely some distortion close to the edges, and you can really see this in photos that have straight lines near the boundaries. But I found that the dynamic range and the color science remains roughly the same across the two cameras, so I guess that's a plus. So now with the wide angle and ultra wide, you also have the option of capturing outside the frame. So now what this does is when you take a photo or video with your standard camera, it also takes a photo and video with your ultra wide. Now what this means is you can go back in post after you've already captured the moment, and you can basically reframe your photo or video to include something that you may have accidentally cut out. Now that's going to stitch together the image from the wide and ultra wide. So there's two things to keep in mind, is that the ultra wide is of a slightly lower quality and that the file sizes do get a lot bigger when you have this turned on. Oh, and a lucky third, the files also only stay for 30 days after you've taken the photo or video. So after that, the wide angle or whatever information was not used gets deleted and you can't change after the fact. And now of course we have night mode. When Apple revealed this on stage, I have to say I wasn't the most keen. It didn't really seem as good as the Pixels or the Samsungs, but having used it in person, I have to say this thing is really good. So really, unlike Pixels, Huawei's or Samsungs, the iPhone is taking a long exposure photo. So handheld, you can take a maximum of what I've seen, a 3-second photo. And now that says something about the image stabilization. The fact that you can take a 3-second long exposure handheld is pretty insane. And now putting it on a tripod, you can get up to a 30-second long exposure. So you're pretty much going to be in a room with no light and you can take a photo for 30 seconds and it will still look pretty damn bright. And even when taking photos handheld, these photos are night and day better than what I expected them to be when I saw the on-stage demo. And now the video capabilities on this phone is once again the best out of any smartphone, like it has been for the past couple of years. And this year's iPhone can shoot 4K 60 frames per second with extended dynamic range, which is just insane. The camera that I'm shooting on right now, the DSLR, pretty much maxes out at 1080p at 24 frames per second. So the fact that this thing can do 4K 60 with extended dynamic range is just mind-blowing. Now I did want to do a more in-depth review about the actual video capabilities of the iPhones, and especially with the video stabilization on this thing being insane. So let me know down in the comment section below if that's something you'd actually be interested in, and we can make that happen. Now beginning to wrap this up, a few last second quick hitters, we also have improvements to the speakers. So now the iPhone 11 this year did improve the speaker quality from the iPhone XR last year, so now that means your audio experience is a lot richer as well as a lot more indulging. And now to begin wrapping things up, we have the battery life. So now there are multiple videos out there that show that the iPhone 11 has the worst camera out of any iPhone this year. Calling it the worst iPhone and saying that it only has 5 hours of screen on time is actually a crime against the iPhone 11. So now I've used this thing all day, every day, trying to kill it, and it still hasn't died on me yet. And now on a day in which I had very heavy use, I managed to get 6 hours and 50 minutes of screen on time, as well as 14 minutes of screen off time, and ended the day with about 14%. Now that is straight up insane. 7 hours of screen on time with 13% left is pretty much all you need from a smartphone battery. And now on a pretty light use with 4 hours and 35 minutes of screen on time, I ended the day with about 35 to 40% battery. So really, charging your phone is not a concern when you're using this. It can get through a day of use really easily. And now the first weekend that I got the phone, I actually did manage to use it for 2 whole days without charging, and it did not die at the end of the second day. I had about 10 or 9% left, but it was pretty light use with only 3 and 3.5 hours of screen on time per day. And now I'm not trying to say the iPhone 11 has better battery life than the 11 Pro or the Pro Max. It definitely doesn't. The Pros and Pros Maxes could probably last 2 days with 4.5, maybe even 5 hours of screen on time if you really push it. But what I'm trying to say is that the iPhone 11 really isn't bad, and the battery shouldn't be the $300 more that you spend to get the Pro, or the $400 to get the Pro Max. So now, of course, the very last thing to consider is the price. Now, this phone starts at $700 US. Not really budget, it's more of a premium budget. You know, there are $600 phones like the OnePlus 7T that are better than the iPhone 11 in some things, but the iPhone 11 is also definitely a lot better than the OnePlus 7T at a lot of things. So to me, really it comes down to whether you want to be part of the Apple ecosystem. So if you're in the market for a new iPhone, the iPhone 11 is definitely the one to get. And even if you're not, as long as you're willing to sacrifice on the display, the iPhone 11 is just as competitive in every other category as any other phone out there. So it really comes down to whether you value a display for $300 or $400. I know I don't, but do you? So now this phone may not be Pro, but it definitely does not have any problems. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like. It really does make a difference. And if you have any questions or any thoughts about the video, please do leave them down in the comment section below. I read all of them, and I may even reply to some of them. So now if you want to see a lot of great content coming up on this channel, then please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on all the great content coming up. There might not be a video about the iPhone 11, but there is definitely a video coming up about the iPhone 11 Pro, and watchOS 6 just came out, so there's going to be a video about that as well. So if you're excited, subscribe, stay tuned, and as always, have a great, great life.